Hey guys, what's going on? Path of Exile 2 recently dropped their 0.3.1 update, and with that came some significant changes to the endgame as we know it. Towers are no longer responsible for providing all the juice that you put into the various maps that you run. Now tablets are used on individual waystones and they influence the individual maps themselves. Prior to this change, the meta strat for towers was to find a 3, sometimes 4 tower overlap, put a bunch of tablets that had an increased quantity of items roll on them, and then stack those as much as possible to then run maps, which, in some cases had 60 plus increased quantity of items, sometimes even 70, 80. Some players were even getting, 90 plus quant on a single map. And those numbers were, pretty insane. Now, with the limit to 3 tablets per map, the upper end of the amount of quantity that you can add to a map has been significantly reduced. The quantity roll on tablets now has a maximum range of 10%, meaning that we can only put a maximum of 30% quantity on a map before all of the Atlas passive multipliers and influences then affect that final quantity value. So what I wanted to do is really test to see, is quantity still the king to juice your maps, or is something like Rarity now something that you can consider as a viable strat to juice your maps and get a decent amount of loot out of them? So I want to go into game and we'll explain a little bit of the setup and sort of how we're going to test things and how we're going to keep track of everything for at the end when we do the final roundup. We'll see what we get. I want to preface this by saying this isn't meant to be a top 1% of the 1% giga juicing strategy where you use a ritual omen and then a chaos orb on all of your maps and get the most amount of item rarity on a map and do all of those sorts of things. I'm going to be using maps that range between 40 to 80% increased item rarity. And we'll see in a little bit when I discuss the maps in a bit more detail how I'm actually able to average that rarity out across the entire set to ensure that we keep things as fair as possible. And I wanted to keep things in this study as fair as possible to really just, look at, is rarity or is quantity better in the current state of the game? So for the tablets themselves, the suffix modifier on all the tablets is the same across the 2 different sets that I'm going to be running. I'm running a irradiation tablet, a breach tablet, as well as an expedition tablet. I think in terms of extracting the most value out of your maps, ritual is probably the better thing to run. However, it adds a lot of time to the maps, and ritual can sometimes be a little bit variable in terms of what you're getting. And I don't want any of the previous stuff that I have in the ritual window to kind of influence or, be calculated into what I currently have. And there are quite a few things in there. So rather than kind of making that distinction, I wanted to just leave it off for the purpose of this to kind of make it as fair as possible. So the suffixes are going to be increased quantity of waystones, not anything significant to the value coming out of the maps, increased number of breach class 10s, and then for expedition, it's going to be increased explosive range placement. So nothing there that's influencing the sort of loot that we're getting out of the maps. The only difference here is going to be either a 30% max roll rarity or a 10% max roll increased quantity across the tablets to see sort of what we get through there. Okay, across the maps, I'm going to be tracking mostly the currency that drops. I'm not tracking every single piece of currency that drops. I think, and also limiting it to the extreme high tiers of currency only, I think is a little bit too restricting. The more things that we can track in order to compare at the end, I think will give us a better overall assessment of which strategy is better in the end. So I'm tracking everything from greater and up. I will track normal exalted orbs as well as chaos orbs for obvious reasons. But things like normal regal orbs, normal transmutations, and augmentations, I don't think are worth tracking. Okay, a little bit more on the maps. So As I mentioned, I'm running maps that have increased item rarity on the waystone itself from between 40 to 80%. And these values that you see here are actually all taken off of the maps that I have in game. I basically copied those numbers over and I tailored them specifically to ensure that the average increased rarity across those 10 maps is exactly the same for both sets. So I have the average rarity here at 53, and that's taking into account all the different maps that we're going to be running over the 10 map set to try and keep things as fair as possible. Okay. 10 maps is a little bit of a small sample size. Perhaps in the future, I might extend it out and do, maybe like a 30, 40, 50 map set. But because this is new and, I was pretty much done with the league before this update has brought me back now to, map a little bit more and just to see how the changes are. I thought it would be fun to kind of just, do this little study, do this little comparison to now see, is quantity still the king of juicing your maps, or is rarity something that, we can now consider putting on our maps to get, some value out of them. In terms of the build I'm running, that's not super important. I'm running a lightning arrow, but I stack a bunch of cold damage because I just like freezing enemies, and having some explosions with Herald Device is fun sometimes. That's not really that significant. What is significant though is the amount of increased rarity that I'm running on my gear, because we know in Path of Exile 2, rarity on gear influences how much currency you are dropping, as well as the level or the rarity of currency that you're dropping as well. So I'm doing this from a 119% rarity perspective. Anywhere between 100 to 150% rarity, I think, is the sweet spot. Obviously, 150, if you want to min-max, would be the absolute best. But as we've seen, there's been plenty of videos on this. Anything over 150% rarity on the character gear has pretty significant diminishing returns. So 150 would kind of be where you would want to, cap out on for that. In terms of the Atlas trees for Expedition, I am running a +1 level of logbooks, increased number of runic markers, increased effect of remnants, and then the extreme archaeology. For Breach, I am running increased quantity of breach splinters. Breaches have increased monster density, chance for additional breaches in the maps, and the Soul Eater mod. I like the Soul Eater because you steal it off of the monsters with Headhunter, and you get a lot of attack speed, and it just makes the maps more fun, a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. So I figured I kept it on there. For the chance to proc additional breaches, I understand that this one can be fairly variable. If I'll make a note, if during any of the maps I run, there are, that chance to proc the, 10 additional breaches, I'll make a note of it, and I will obviously, tally up the currency as I will in every single map. It is variable. Hopefully it doesn't proc over the next 10 maps for each of those, for each set. But I like the Soul Eater enough that I kind of want it. So if it happens, it happens, but I'll make a note if it does happen, and we'll factor that into any of the final numbers that we get when we tally everything up. For the Atlas tree itself, fairly standard juicing tree that you would want to run. A little bit of increased quantity that we have where we can. A little bit of increased rare monsters duplicated. Kind of a little bit worse now that they've removed the rare monster markers from the map. I will try and clear the maps to the point that there is, under 50 monsters remaining. So you see the counter in the top right, where it lets you know how many monsters are remaining. I will try and get every single rare monster. If I miss one or two, nothing I can really do to help that. Some of the layouts are terrible. Having the rare monster markers on the map was actually really valuable in helping you traverse the flow and the feel of some of the really, really bad layouts. So I hope they bring that back. I hope them taking it off is just a bug or an oversight on their part. But if anyone from GGG ever sees this video, which I doubt they will, but the rare monster markers on the map were fantastic. And now it kind of makes mapping a little bit not as fun. But the rest of the tree will be a little bit of pack size, increased effect of explicit mods on waystones, and then the tablet increased effect modifiers as well. And then the 20% chance to double the effect of the precursors. So, if that procs, I'm not specifically going to check in game to see if it does proc. I'm just going to go off of, the baseline that 20% of the time it will happen. So, in 2 out of those 10 maps for rarity, we should start with a base of, 180% increased rarity. And for quantity, we should start at a baseline of 60% quantity, and then all of the other increases off of that. So we'll just go based off of that, but I'm not going to be checking specifically in each for to see if it actually did proc. Okay, so I will go run these 20 maps. I will track all of the currency. I'll also make a note of any significant unique drops that we get, because stacking rarity might actually, give us some more uniques and some better tier uniques that drop. Basically anything significant of value that drops, runes that are valuable, obviously the various currency, I will keep track of. Individual items themselves, probably not. Rare items, even tier 5 rares now are actually really bad. How they drop, considering perfect alterations and augmentations exist. You can just spam those on a bunch of bases and get pretty much guaranteed tier 1, tier 2 mods. So rare items aren't very that valuable off the floor anymore, but I will track anything of significance and probably take some clips throughout if anything good drops, and then have those when we do the recap at the end. I'll check in after these 20 maps. We'll tally up all the numbers and we will see which one of these is actually better. Is it going to still be quantity, or is rarity now something that we can consider to get significant value out of the maps that we're running? All right, guys, I just got done running the set of 20 maps, 10 with rarity, 10 with quantity. I'm not going to include any highlights of what we did in the maps. Mainly, once we get into the results, you'll kind of understand that. And I think this entire test, or showcase, or whatever you want to call it, can kind of be summed up with one single meme. This one right here on the screen. Yeah, it was pretty bad. To put it bluntly, it was not great. I wasn't expecting to get great, loot out of this. But it was worse than I thought. I'll show you some pictures of what my currency stash looked like after certain number of maps. I emptied the currency stash, tracked everything. I also tracked everything in a spreadsheet. Had an empty currency tab, threw everything in there, tracked it, and then cleared it again, and then ran the quantity maps and did exactly the same for that. So I ran the rarity maps, and we got 2 raw div, 49x, 2 greater x, 9 chaos, 1 greater chaos, some augmentations and things like that. Not the greatest, a little bit of abyssal stuff. I wasn't too pleased with this. I thought, rarity isn't something that, people were juicing in the past. It was always quantity, right? Quantity was always the thing that you wanted in your maps in order to actually get good loot. And then I ran the quantity maps, and it was arguably worse, maybe slightly better. We got 3 raw div, which all came from a single map, which you'll see when we go over to the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet here kind of isn't even that necessary. I almost felt kind of dumb for keeping one because the drops were just so bad. But we'll go through it in a second. But in terms of the total number of chaos, total number of exalted, and even the transmutation and augmentations were significantly less with increased quantity as opposed to increased rarity. In an ideal scenario, the greater versions of these currency items, you're going to be hiding them on your filter. I included them just to have something extra to be able to compare across the two runs. But if I put these two side by side, it's not looking too great. Rarity over here on the left, and then quantity over here on the right. Yeah, it was not fun to run these maps. The drops just weren't great, and that kind of contributed to everything that was going on. I did end up keeping track of the rarity and the quantity in the map after I opened it. Once all of the explicit modifier effects come into play and everything like that. The rarity wasn't terrible in most of the maps. The quantity, this 4%, is just the base of what you're getting off of the Atlas tree. But some of these were decent rarity. There were no significant unique drops of anything valuable. For the quantity maps, 43 seems to be basically the maximum of what you can get now without having the double effect of precursor tablets proc. So you're getting 30% from the tablets, the 32% increase from the Atlas tree, and then the base 4% on the nodes. So I think in total that comes to like 43.6%. And then POE rounds down, so it ends up being 43%. And then on map 10, I ended up getting the double proc, which I was like, oh, great. We have, great quantity on this. 82% is, quite a lot of quant in POE2. And the map was just terrible. Like, just absolutely terrible loot. Like 82% quant, 1 in 5, or sorry, 1 in 5 maps, if you're using max rolled tablets. 1 in 5 maps, you get, your proc. I got a little unlucky only getting 1 out of 10. It is what it is. But, even with 82% quant, we are mapping for 3 greater transmutes, 1 greater augmentation, 3 Val orbs, 3 exalted orbs with 82% quant, 1 chaos orb, and I got a normal heavy belt, which you can sell to people that are chancing or chance it yourself. That's basically what we're mapping for. On average, we're mapping for the rarity, 2 greater transmutes per map, 2 greater augs per map, about 5x per map. Less than 1k, about let's say 1 chaos per map. If we're running quantity, we're mapping for even less, for 4 exalteds per map. I averaged, and I understand this is a small sample size, but more power to you if you want to continue this out over 50, 100 maps. Have fun, because the maps won't be fun. I'll put it that way. The other thing I want to stress here too is I ran these all on clean maps. And what I mean by that is maps, I went, to a corner of my atlas that was unexplored, and I ran this on maps that didn't have any prior tower influence on them, because all of the tower tablets that you put in prior to the update, those stay on the map. So for example, this has 6% quant for some random tablet that I put in, weeks ago. Over here, I think I have ones down here. I had a good tower setup that I bookmarked here. Some of these, so this is like 35% increased quant. So when the patch dropped, I was, running some of these that already had the towers influencing them. And then I put the new quant tablets on top, and I was running the maps, and I was like, okay, this loot isn't too bad. Not realizing you're getting a false sense of, loot, because you already have the old tower mechanic influencing these maps. That's not how it's going to be in future leagues. All of these maps are going to be, quote unquote, clean, right? They're going to have nothing on them. There's not going to be any quant on them before you put the tablets in. So if this is any indication of what the mapping experience is going to be like, it's not great. Mapping already wasn't in a great state in this game to begin with. Most of the currency that you would make this league would be through crafting, because crafting got, a big update, which is great. The crafting in the game is fantastic. Probably a little too powerful with how deterministic it is. But all of the money to be made this league was all in crafting. Um, Mapping just isn't there. It's not like POE1 where there's a dozen different mapping strats that will make you solid amount of divines per hour, and you buy your gear and craft your gear and have fun just getting drops. Like, that's why PoE is fun. You get drops. This is not drops. This is scrounging for what, 1.7 greater augs per map on something that you're gonna hide on your filter anyway. Like, something you hide on your filter, you're supposed to get like 20 of per map, and they are worth nothing. This is less than 2 per map on an item that's worth nothing. So I don't know. I'll kind of leave it off here, or I'll give my opinion on this. Basically, my opinion on this: sit in your hideout, craft, and if your goal is to make currency, that's the way you got to do it, because mapping is not in a good state. At least with what I've tested here, it doesn't make me optimistic for mapping in future leagues. Hopefully something changes, because this loot feels not great. And I'll kind of leave it on this. They said, the ceiling for the amount of content you can apply to a single map has been lowered. Overall, this results in a more streamlined and consistent experience, a consistently bad experience, in my case here over these last 20 maps. But in order to not have the ceiling come down too far, we've buffed modifiers on the tablets. I don't think they've just lowered the ceiling. I think they demolished the entire roof, and there's nothing left in the worst way possible.